Nobody warned Catherine Elliott that the last hug would be the longest one. Nobody warns you about that. Nobody sits you down before the hard years begin and says, pay attention to the long ones. The ones where the other person doesn't let go right away. The ones where you can feel something being said in the pressure of arms that isn't being said anywhere else. Nobody tells you that sometimes the body knows what the mind hasn't accepted yet. And that love, when it is running out of time, communicates through touch the way it never quite managed through language. Catherine was 58 years old when her mother held her that last time. Eleanor Elliott, 81, standing in the doorway of her house in Charlottesville, Virginia, the house where Catherine had grown up, where the kitchen still smelled like the same dish soap it had always smelled like, where the third step from the bottom still creaked, in the specific way it had creaked since 1987. Eleanor had walked Catherine to the door the way she always did, the way she had done every Sunday for 11 years since Catherine's father passed, and Catherine had started making the drive from Richmond every week without being asked, without discussing it, just showing up, because showing up was what the Elliott women did when things were hard, and when things were good, and when things were ordinary, which was most of the time, and ordinary was its own kind of gift that Catherine had not understood until much later. That Sunday, Eleanor had held on longer than usual. Catherine had noticed it. She had registered it the way you register something without fully processing it, the way you notice a sound in the house at night and tell yourself it's nothing and go back to sleep. She had driven the 2 hours back to Richmond thinking about the meeting she had Monday morning and the dry cleaning she needed to pick up, and whether she had remembered to set the coffee maker. And she had not thought, not once on that entire drive, about the way her mother's arms had held her with a specificity, a deliberateness that was different from the 1,000 hugs that had come before it. She thought about it 3 weeks later, when Eleanor Elliott did not wake up on a Tuesday morning in February. She thought about it for a long time after that. Catherine had been, for most of her adult life, what people who knew her described as self-sufficient. She meant this as a compliment to herself. She had built a career in healthcare administration, 26 years of managing hospital systems, budgets, people, crises, and she had built it with the particular focused energy of a woman who learned early that competence is a form of protection. If you are capable enough, organized enough, prepared enough, then the things that undo other people cannot undo you. This was not a philosophy she had articulated. It was simply how she moved through the world, as naturally as breathing, as invisible to herself as the air. She had been married once, to a man named David, a kind and patient man who had loved her thoroughly, and whom she had loved in return, but who had said to her near the end of their 12 years together, not in anger, not as an accusation, but in the gentle, exhausted tone of someone stating a fact they have held for too long, Catherine, I don't think you actually need anyone, and I don't think I can spend the rest of my life trying to be needed. She had argued with this. She had told him he was wrong. But she had also, in the quiet honesty of the weeks that followed their separation, understood that he was not entirely wrong, and that understanding had sat in her like a small cold stone for a very long time. After David, she had her work. She had her friends, 3 women she had known since college, who called on birthdays and met for dinner twice a year, and knew the broad outlines of her life with the comfortable imprecision of people who love each other from a certain distance. She had her apartment in Richmond, which she had furnished carefully and kept immaculately, and which felt, most days, like exactly enough. And she had Eleanor, every Sunday. 2 hours there, 2 hours back. Lunch that Eleanor made and refused to let Catherine help with. The particular rituals of a relationship that had been going on so long it had its own grammar. The specific chair Catherine sat in, the cup Eleanor used for her tea, the way they watched the evening news together with the sound too loud because Eleanor refused to acknowledge she needed a hearing aid. The conversations that circled back to the same stories from the same decades, because that is what memory does in its later years, and Catherine had learned not to correct the repetitions but to receive them as the gift they were each time, evidence that the story still mattered enough to tell. She had not understood in those 11 years of Sundays that she needed Eleanor. She had told herself she was doing something for her mother, being a good daughter. Fulfilling an obligation she was glad to fulfill. She had not understood that she was also, every week, driving 2 hours to fill something in herself that nothing else quite reached. She understood it now. The grief arrived in a way that surprised her. Catherine had handled the funeral with the efficiency she brought to everything. Arrangements, calls, paperwork, the reception afterward at Eleanor's house where she stood and received condolences with composure, and said thank you and offered food and made sure everyone had what they needed. Her college friend Patricia had pulled her aside during the reception and said, "Quietly, Catherine, you don't have to run this." And Catherine had said, "I'm fine," and gone to check on the food. She was fine for approximately 3 weeks. And then one Sunday morning, she got in her car out of pure muscle memory and drove 40 minutes toward Charlottesville before she realized where she was going. She sat on the side of the highway for a long time. Cars passing. The particular meaninglessness of a Sunday morning that has nowhere to arrive at. She turned around and drove home and went inside and sat on her kitchen floor and cried in a way she had not cried since she was 9 years old and had fallen off a bicycle and Eleanor had held her on the back porch until the crying was completely finished, not rushing it, not trying to stop it, just holding it with her. There was nobody to hold it with her now. She sat on the kitchen floor for a very long time. The house in Charlottesville had to be dealt with. Catherine had a brother, Philip, 4 years older, who lived in Seattle and had flown in for the funeral and been genuinely, visibly devastated in a way that Catherine had found simultaneously comforting and destabilizing. Philip cried openly at the funeral, at the reception, on the phone with Catherine twice in the week that followed, and each time Catherine had found herself in the strange position of comforting her older brother's grief while her own sat unexpressed. Inside her, like water behind a dam she could not locate. They agreed over several phone calls that Catherine would handle the house. Philip would fly back in May. They would go through it together. Catherine said this was fine. It was not fine. It was the only available option. She went to the house in Charlottesville for the first time. After the funeral on a Saturday in March, alone, telling herself she was going to make a practical assessment of what needed to be done. She had a notepad. She had a pen. She had a list of categories and furniture, clothes, paperwork, personal items, and with subcategories, because Catherine Elliott did not go anywhere without a list. She opened the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled like Eleanor. It was not a dramatic smell, not perfume, not something specific she could name. Just the accumulated scent of a life lived in particular rooms for many decades, the specific warmth of a house that had been inhabited by one person for a long time. Catherine stood in the hallway and breathed it in, and the list in her hand became, briefly, completely irrelevant. She stood there for a long time. Then she walked to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at the table where they had eaten lunch every Sunday for 11 years. The specific chair, the cup still in the drying rack, the dish soap on the sink, the same one, the same brand, unchanged for 40 years. She sat down in her chair, the one that was always hers, and put her notepad on the table and did not open it. She stayed in the house until it was dark outside. She did not make a list. She walked through the room slowly, touching things. The bookshelf in the living room, the photograph on the hallway wall of a family vacation in 1984, the quilt on Eleanor's bed that Eleanor had made herself decades ago, the slightly crooked frame in the second bedroom that Catherine had always meant to straighten and never had. She did not assess. She did not categorize. She just moved through the rooms, the way you move through a place that has held you, letting it hold you one more time. Before she left, she went to the doorway, Eleanor's doorway, the one where Eleanor had always stood to watch her go, and she stood in it and looked back at the empty hallway and understood, with the full weight of something she had been carrying without knowing, that she had been loved here, completely, consistently, without condition or performance, that every Sunday for 11 years she had driven 2 hours to this house, and every time she had left, her mother had stood in this doorway and watched until the car was out of sight. Every time. She had not understood what that was. She understood it now. The grief counselor's name was Dr. Anita Shaw, and she worked out of a small office in Richmond, with large windows and a fiddle leaf fig that was either thriving or dramatically dying. Catherine could never quite tell which. Catherine had been referred to her by her physician, and she had made the appointment with the same practical efficiency she brought to medical appointments generally, noting the day and time in her calendar and arriving exactly on schedule. She sat across from Dr. Shaw in the second week and said, "I want to talk about the hug." Dr. Shaw looked at her steadily. "Tell me." So Catherine told her. The Sunday. The doorway. The way Eleanor had held on longer than usual. The way Catherine had driven home thinking about dry cleaning. "And now?" Dr. Shaw asked. "Now I think she knew," Catherine said. "I think her body knew something was coming. And I think that hug was her trying to—" She stopped, found the words, trying to put everything in it that she hadn't managed to put anywhere else. "What do you think she was trying to put in it?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Everything," she said finally. 81 years of everything. Every Sunday. Every lunch. All those times she stood in the doorway watching me. Go. Her voice changed on the last sentence, shifted register slightly, the way voices do when the truth is sitting directly underneath the words. I didn't understand that she was telling me something every time she did that. I thought she was just watching me leave, but she was telling me she would be there when I came back. Every time. Dr. Shaw let the silence sit before she spoke. "What would you say to her," she asked, "if you could say something now?" Catherine looked at her hands. "I would tell her that I needed her more than I let myself know, and that I'm sorry I made it look like I didn't." Philip came in May as planned. He was different from Catherine in nearly every way. Louder, more emotionally transparent, the kind of man who said what he felt and then felt it again out loud in company. He had his mother's eyes. Catherine had their father's way of moving through the world, that particular self-contained quality that could be called strength and could be called something more complicated, and was probably both. They spent 3 days at the Charlottesville house together, going through Eleanor's things, and it was not the clinical exercise Catherine had tried to make it on her first visit. Philip cried at things, Eleanor's handwriting on the back of a photograph, a birthday card he found in her bedside drawer that she had apparently never sent, a particular cardigan folded in the closet that he said he remembered from childhood, and Catherine, who had prepared herself to be the composed one, the efficient one, found that in Philip's presence and the specific permission of being with someone who let it show she could not quite sustain the composure. They sat on the kitchen floor on the second evening, both of them eating takeout from a restaurant downtown because neither could quite face cooking in Eleanor's kitchen. And Philip said, "Do you remember how she always waited in the doorway until you couldn't see her anymore?" Catherine set down her fork. "Yes," she said. "I used to think she was just being, mommish, watching us go." Philip was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. "I figured out eventually that she was doing it so that the last thing we saw when we looked back was her, still there, so we'd know." Catherine looked at her brother. "Know what?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. "That she wasn't going anywhere," Philip said. "That home was still there. That she was still there. So whenever it got hard, wherever we were, we could remember looking back and seeing her in that doorway and know there was somewhere that was going to hold us." Catherine was quiet for a long time. "I didn't look back," she said. "Most times. I would hug her and walk to the car and get in and go. I didn't look back." Philip looked at her, not with judgment and with the specific understanding of someone who has known you your entire life. "She waited anyway," he said. "Every time, whether you looked back or not." Catherine nodded. Something in her chest was very full. "That was Mom," Philip said simply. And he picked up his fork and they ate in silence, and the kitchen held them, the way it had always held everyone who sat in it, and that was enough. And it was also devastating. And it was also, somehow beneath all of it, all right. She sold the house in August. To a young family, a couple in their early 30s with a 4-year-old and what appeared to be, based on the careful way the wife moved through the rooms, another child coming. They had walked through the house with the specific reverence of people who recognize a place that has been well loved, and the woman had stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame and looked at the room and said, "You can feel it." That people were happy here. Catherine had said yes, they were. She stood in the doorway, Eleanor's doorway, one last time before handing over the keys. She looked back at the hallway, the staircase, the photograph still on the wall because she had decided to leave it, a gift for the new family who would never know who the people in it were, but would feel, perhaps, the residue of having been loved in a particular place for a long time. She stood there for a minute, maybe longer. She was not entirely sure. Then she walked to her car and she got in and she looked in the rear view mirror at the house and at the doorway, empty now, and she let herself look. She sat and looked at it until she was finished looking, because she had not looked back enough times in her life, and she was correcting that now, one moment at a time. She still drove to Charlottesville, not to a destination at first, just the drive. The same 2 hours, the familiar turns and exits, and the particular way the landscape changed once you crossed into Albemarle County. She drove it twice in the fall without planning to, because her body remembered it the way bodies remember, the paths they have traveled in love. In October, she found a place to go. There was a community garden near downtown, Charlottesville, not far from Eleanor's house, as it happened, where volunteers worked on Saturday mornings. Catherine had read about it in a small way, the kind of reading you do when your mind is looking for something and hasn't told you yet what it's looking for. She went one Saturday, brought work gloves, did not know what she was doing, and said so directly to the older woman who was managing the volunteer section, a woman named Ruth who was approximately Eleanor's age and had Eleanor's particular quality of being completely unimpressed by anything that wasn't genuine. Ruth had handed her a trowel and shown her where to dig. Catherine had dug. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By December, she was driving to Charlottesville every other week, not every Sunday. Not the same rhythm, but a rhythm of its own. She worked in the garden, in the mornings when the weather allowed, and sat in a small cafe nearby when it didn't. And she was learning slowly and imperfectly to be in a place without managing it, to be present in a city that still held the shape of someone she had loved, and to let the shape be there rather than organizing her way around it. She was learning to need things. It was harder than she had expected. It was necessary in a way she had not previously made room for. Philip called every Sunday now. They had started this after the house was sold. Not formally, not with a discussion, just Philip calling on a Sunday evening and Catherine answering. And neither of them remarking on it, because remarking on it would have made it something they had decided rather than something that had simply become true. Sometimes they talked for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour, sometimes about Eleanor, sometimes about their own lives, sometimes about nothing particular. One Sunday in November, Philip said, "I've been thinking about that last hug she gave you, the one you told me about." Catherine had told him over the summer. It had been easier to tell than she expected. "What about it?" she said. "I've been trying to remember mine," Philip said. "My last one. And I think it was at the airport in September, when I left after my summer visit, and I think she held on longer than usual that time, too." A pause. "I think she did it with both of us." Catherine closed her eyes briefly. "Of course she did," she said. "She was putting everything in it," Philip said. "The way you said, all of it." "Yes. Do you think she knew?" Catherine thought about this honestly before she answered. "I think part of her knew," she said. "The part of us that knows things before we're ready to know them. I think that part of her knew, and it found the only way it could to say what needed to be said." Philip was quiet. "Then she said it," he said. "She said everything. We just didn't hear it the right way." "We heard it," Catherine said. "We just didn't translate it until later, after she hung up." Catherine sat in her apartment for a while, in the particular quiet of a Sunday evening. She thought about Eleanor in the doorway. She thought about the long hug. She thought about the distance between "I love you" said in words, and "I love you" said in the pressure of arms that hold on longer than they need to. She thought about David and about self-sufficiency, and about the long mistake of believing that needing no one was a form of strength rather than a form of hiding. She thought about Ruth at the garden, who had called her last week just to say the early bulbs were coming up, and she thought Catherine would want to know, and about the way Catherine had felt receiving that call, a small uncomplicated warmth, the specific pleasure of being thought of by someone who had no obligation to think of her. She was letting herself need things. It was slow. It was real. It was the most important work she had ever done. In February, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, Catherine drove to Charlottesville. Not to the house. The house belonged to the young family now, and she hoped they were well and warm in it, and that the kitchen was full of the sound of people who loved each other. She drove to a small cemetery on the east side of the city where Eleanor was buried beside Catherine's father, and she sat with them for a while in the cold February morning, not talking exactly, not praying exactly, just being present in the way she was learning to be present, without managing, without efficiency, without a list. She had brought nothing. No flowers. She had meant to bring flowers and forgotten, and she decided to forgive herself for this and come back with them another time rather than turn it into a failure. She sat on the cold ground, actually sat, because the bench nearby was damp, and looked at Eleanor's name on the stone. Eleanor Ruth Elliott, beloved. She thought about the doorway. She thought about every Sunday. She thought about the long hug at the end of a particular Sunday in November, her mother's arms around her in the November light, holding on with the specific intention of someone who is trying to put everything into a single gesture so that nothing is left unsaid. She sat with this for a long time. Then she said out loud in the cold February air, to no one and to someone, I needed you. I need you still. I should have let you see that. She said it clearly without embarrassment, the way she was learning to say things that were true. The February air was very still. She stayed until she was cold enough that staying longer would have been suffering, rather than presence, and then she got up and walked back to her car, and drove out of the cemetery and took the long route back, toward the highway, past Eleanor's street, past the house where the lights were on and the young family was warm inside, and the doorway that had held so many departures was holding someone new now. She looked at the doorway as she passed. Then she looked forward at the road, at the direction she was going. She drove home. She called Philip when she got in, and he answered on the second ring, and she said, I went today, and he said, I know. Me too, not there, just here, by myself, and she said, that counts, and he said, I know. Then they talked for an hour about ordinary things. Because ordinary things are not ordinary. Because ordinary things are the whole of it. Because 11 years of Sunday, lunches and dish soap and the same cup for tea and a doorway. Woman who waited every single time. That is not nothing. That is everything. That is the only thing that in the end can be held. Before she went to sleep that night, Catherine sat in the chair by her window and thought about the hug one more time. She had spent a year thinking about it. She expected she would spend more years thinking about it still. But it had shifted, the way the hardest things shift, when you stop carrying them alone from something she couldn't touch to something she could hold. A thing that hurt and also did not hurt. A thing that was loss and also the most complete expression of love she had ever been given. Eleanor had put everything into it, and Catherine, who had spent a lifetime believing that she didn't need to be held, finally understood that she had been held all along. She had just finally stopped being too busy to feel it. She closed her eyes. Outside, February was cold and dark and ordinary and exactly as it should be. She slept.